We can do aging reversal.
So you take it for a week, reverses your aging?
3 years, we're into human clinical trial, $2 a dose.
Woolly Mammoth could roam the earth by 2027.
No. CRISPR is genetic engineering.
Were these babies born?
It increased their IQ substantially.
As far as we know, they're healthy.
Received a new heart from a genetically modified pig.
The listeners to this podcast would love to feel younger and actually be younger. We ask if it's possible to edit our body to create genetic modification in order to make ourselves younger.
My name's Izabella Kaminska and I am a journalist, formerly at the FT. We spoke with, in our latest installation of the podcast,
George Church,
a pioneer in the field of genetics and a resident professor at Harvard Medical School.
one of the most creative and out-of-box thinkers I've ever met.
He is an expert in the field of
The use of CRISPR technology to create genetic modifications.
So we sat down with him and talked to him about work he has been doing and the amazing developments that are going on.
We asked George if it's actually possible to edit our body in order to make ourselves younger.
He has integrity and
George is helping us redefine life itself.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thank you.
What type of things are there in terms of extending life?
Do you think it will happen in your lifetime that you can reverse age somebody?
Reversing aging could be as simple as a pill at the doctor's office.
Scientists have rejuvenated the skin cells taken from a 53-year-old woman, making them equivalent to those of a 23-year-old. They might be able to do the same thing with other tissues in the body. The eventual aim is to develop treatments for age-related disease such as diabetes, heart disease, and neurological disorders.
So maybe once a year you go get a prescription for your doctor, you take it for a week and it reverses your aging. Is that your vision here?
Well, it's not just a vision, it's going to happen.
Doc didn't quite believe that some of these samples were 30 years younger than...
And when we turn those 3 genes back on in the adult tissue, the mice regenerate and they get their vision back.
What type of things are there in terms of extending life?
Do you think it will happen in your lifetime that you can reverse age somebody?
Well, it's already happened in my lifetime that we can do what looks like aging reversal in mice and probably in dogs as well. So yes, I mean, it could be as little as 2-3 years before we're into human clinical trials. So yes, I think this is happening in our lifetime. Aging reversal is something that's much easier to get approval from the FDA. You have almost every disease has a big aging component. You know, even COVID-19 has a steep increase with age, falling down and not getting up. So it's all sorts of accidents and responses to them. Almost every disease. And so if you can cure disease of aging, and a lot of them, then you're probably affecting aging rather than just some symptom of aging. And so it has a lot of progress, partly because of all the progress in synthetic biology and gene therapy and so forth. So I think we're going to see various aging reversals. We've already got some that are being in clinical trials for dogs, and then that will quickly transition into human clinical time.
And what would that process involve? Like, so it's obviously, I mean, just could you unpack like what the science is all about in terms of that process? Just is it targeting a specific sort of DNA structure? What is it doing? As simply as possible. I'm sure it's incredibly complex, but is there a sort of easy way to kind of?
I think there's two major school of thoughts. One is that as you age, there's damage that accumulates, and you have to somehow reverse that damage. The other school is that you have cells that, because they think they're young, they automatically do the damage control. They just like many younger cells are just healthier. And there are many ways of convincing cells that they're younger that have been shown to work in animals, mainly in mice. So, for example, there's a cocktail of proteins that, when applied to a cell or expressed within a cell, cause that cell to go from, let's say you take my 67-year-old cells and add these 4 transcription factors, the cells now become embryonic-like. Now that's probably going too far, but you can dial it up and down to how far back you want to go in time. But this has been done in hundreds of labs around the world, as you can take old cells and turn them into embryonic cells and almost anything in between. And so these have now made their way into gene therapies, where you'll put these rejuvenating factors into a virus-like particle, just like what we were describing for vaccines. They will make mice so that they will restore heart function, liver, kidney function, breakage in the optic nerve. All of that's restored at youthful rates rather than at the rate that an older animal would restore function.
And so the idea is it would be very similar to how like the vaccines work. So there'd be like an injection of some variety. Right. Yeah.
It's an injection. It could be injected systemically, meaning into your blood, and then it goes everywhere your blood goes, which is basically everywhere in your body. And then it finds ideally it would go into every cell, or at least every stem cell in your body, and cause rejuvenation.
So it's literally that film, Death Becomes Her. I don't know if you're familiar, like with Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn, where they find the magical elixir that makes. I mean, I guess it's a theme of many films and fables. But what you're saying is that we are within scientific grasp of making that a reality. Well, if that does become a viable product, that to me is, that's probably like the top product in the world. How do you think the distribution of something like that would and when it's created, how do you envisage it being distributed? Like, would everyone get it? Would there be, who would be the first beneficiary? There are all sorts of ethical quandaries related to that. What have you thought about it? What are your sort of concerns or ideas about how to do that?
Yes, my colleagues and I have given quite a bit of thought and discussion and articles about those sorts of topics. I think I would hope that it would be distributed the way that medicine in general. It is a medicine. It's reversing diseases of aging, which is most diseases. One of the issues about equitable distribution is cost. After you've addressed safety and efficacy, while you're addressing safety and efficacy, you want to address cost. The vaccines that I mentioned can be as low as $2 a dose. So it's getting into the range where it's affordable. And in fact, the costs of age-related diseases is enormous. It's trillions of dollars per year worldwide. Now, it matters whether you're just pushing it down the road but even pushing it down the road rather than immortality would have at least a temporary benefit in that many people might be inclined to not retire. Certainly, I have no intention to retire. And if you're feeling youthful, then you can be a productive member of society, producing wealth rather than consuming it. So it could have big financial consequences in that regard.
And what about the implications for like population growth? Because presumably, if people aren't dying,
I mean, I don't think we should try to have people live for a very long time. It would cause ossification of society, because the truth is, most people don't change their mind; they just die. And so, if they don't die, we'll be stuck with old ideas, and society won't advance.
And what about the implications for like population growth? Because presumably, if people aren't dying or dying later because they're living longer, then there is a population control issue on the birth side of the equation. What's the ethical, thinking on that?
Yes, so there is some concern that as we go into cities, our family size is decreasing dramatically. So in the sort of rural past, a family size of 8 was common, sort of an average, because of expectations for death and migration and taking care of the parents and things like that. The 8 was a good number. But in the city, the average now is around 1.2, which is not even replacement level. So with now 60, 80, soon maybe 90% of the population being in cities, that could result in a population implosion rather than explosion. So we might want to have a force of aging reversal that would counteract that a little bit. So it's not necessarily it could be a good thing, but all of this has to be managed. Also, there's some possibility that we might want to get some fraction of the population off the planet, just as a backup, if nothing else. There's certain existential risks that could put our entire population at risk. Supervolcanoes, asteroids, solar flares, and so on. And so and there's some estimates that the cost of getting off the planet could be not right now, but could be in the range that individual families could afford. So so it could be like when Asians and Europeans went to what's now the Americas. So all of these things mean that it's not a simple yes, no, positive, negative, economic and ethical question.
I mean, that's fascinating. So this whole idea of genetic life extension, you see it being coupled with sort of off-planet living and kind of...
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm saying that there are two things. That one is the implosion of population growth due to moving to cities, which I think is inevitable. And then there's the possibility, in no way is it coupled, they're independent. Both have implications on population dynamics.
So the idea being that we shouldn't worry about overpopulation because of these technologies, because there will be enough factors potentially in the future sort of depressing the population that it will even itself out.
Yeah, I almost never say don't worry. I just give facts that one can allow one to do policy and personal planning.
You're trying to resurrect the woolly mammoth. So 2 questions. Tell us a little bit about that, and can you resurrect a Tasmanian tiger?
An audacious plan to bring back animals that lived here tens of thousands of years ago.
Woolly mammoth could roam the earth by 2027.
A team of American scientists are working to recreate the prehistoric beasts.
Geoscientist George Church and his company Colossal trying to revive the extinct creature. It'll take about 6 years to grow the mammoths in artificial wombs like this one. Then they'll be dropped into a park in Siberia to eat grass and tamp down snow.
You're trying to resurrect the woolly mammoth. 2 questions. Tell us a little bit about that, and can you resurrect a Tasmanian tiger?
So we're actually trying to resurrect extinct species so much as we have resurrected extinct gene versions. So at least 2 genes have been shown to be appropriate for a cold environment that were extinct and were rescued from the elephant. And there's even some information that's been rescued billions of years back by using phylogenetic tricks. But actual DNA is only a million years. We're not limited to ancient DNA in what we're doing we're trying to make cold resistant elephants, both help save an endangered species by providing them new land to occupy, but also to restore the ecosystem of the Arctic, which is in grave danger of releasing monumental amounts of methane, which is a even worse global warming gas than carbon dioxide. So amounts of methane that are far beyond anything that humans produce.
Isabella, any more questions?
I mean, the idea of extinct animals being revived is like, I mean, I'm just being basic here, but it just strikes me, as a Jurassic Park type nightmare to happen. So I'm
I agree. That's why we're focusing on endangered species as our top priority.
Not the T-Rex.
I think that endangered carnivores are also important, but I think we're starting with the herbivore.
Fair enough. And the dodo was probably okay. I don't
Well, it is extinct, and it's not at the top of I think of my list. But I think it's going
Poor
to.
dodo. It's discrimination against the dodo.
We're discriminating against extinct species in general. But if they have genes that could be of benefit to human needs,
you know about
ecological needs.
You know about the Polish bison in the primeval forest, because that's a fascinating story about how they're the last sort of wild bison in Europe, and in the last primeval forest on the border with Belarus, and they were slightly inbred from what I remember. I was there like maybe over 20 years ago, and it was a big problem because there was such a small gene pool, and they were trying to grow them, but they did need like a lot of diversity to maintain the population. I don't know what's happened since, but maybe you know better. But it seems like in the woolly mammal sort of area.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So the American bison, or bison in general all over the world, were almost completely extinct, down into the low hundreds. And now the worldwide bison population is, I've been told, up to 500,000. So we have shown that we're capable of rewilding, which in a certain sense, some of these species were only alive in captivity. So they were extinct in the wild. And there's probably over 1,000 cases of rewilding, either for local populations or globally, where it was extinct in the wild globally. We hear about cases where an invasive species got carried by a ship accidentally and caused trouble. But what we don't hear about is the thousands of cases where we very intentionally restored a species. This has happened in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. So I think that the most famous case is restoring the wolves to Yellowstone. It was predicted by ecologists how it would have a ripple effect all the way through the ecosystems, through the tree, the herbivores, then the trees, and then the beavers, and then the lakes, and it did. It had exactly that effect.
I don't know enough about this. What was the story about the CRISPR babies?
CRISPR is genetic engineering. They were trying to see if it could be used to eliminate genes that cause certain diseases.
Yeah.
Right?
Beautiful little Chinese girl.
This is the doctor who changed the future of the human race and let the world know on YouTube.
What they did in China, they said they were inoculating these children for HIV. It just, by happenstance, made them much smarter. It increased their IQ substantially.
He Jianquai stunned the scientific community with the claim he pushed the boundary no one else had.
A line has been crossed that should not have been crossed.
It's very disturbing. It's inappropriate.
Oh, this is huge.
He says he genetically edited human embryos, not just for research but for implantation, leading to the world's first births of genetically altered humans, baby girls born in China from embryos designed to be resistant to HIV.
This specific case, I feel proud, actually.
I mean, there were lots of people that knew about the babies that were born, the CRISPR babies, both in China and the United States, and none of them reported it. And I think
I don't know enough about this. What was the story about the CRISPR babies?
it's just that there was kind of worldwide unanimous opinion that we were not ready to apply editing to the germline, to inheritance, and a scientist did that in China.
Were these babies born?
They're healthy, as far as we know. They're healthy 3-year-olds.
Oh wow!
2 or 3 of them. So
and what were
other
the genetic changes? Like what did they do?
They were engineered to with a CCR5 as a gene that is part of the process by which HIV gets into your T cells, and so they were made. At least one of them was made so that they were deficient in the CCR5 gene and therefore potentially resistant to HIV. This is a gene therapy that was already approved by the FDA for clinical trials in the United States in adults. So it wasn't a completely wacky idea. And HIV is a stigmatizing disease in many countries, including China. And it is not a solved problem. 2 million people die a year from HIV, even though we do have drugs and we have safe sex protocols. Those are not sufficient. So, it isn't something that you can get by genetic counseling or other normal medical means. So some of the criteria, by no means all of them, were being satisfied by this experiment. And relative to many other new medical technologies, this was not obviously life-threatening. So the first clinical trials on monoclonal antibodies, which are now a major source of healthcare, and the first clinical trials on gene therapy, which are now also saved many lives, those two had deaths or very close to death in the first round of clinical trials, while this did not. So it's not one of these things where it's just an obvious, easy decision as to what's ethical, what's not ethical, whether publishing the papers is ethical or unethical, whether doing a preventative medical procedure is ahead of its time or it will never be adopted. So anyway, that he was, I think 3 scientists were convicted. At least one of them spent some sort of time in prison for the last 3 years. And I think it was a 3-year term, so it's over or nearly over. He did go through a checklist of things that he thought he was getting the appropriate kinds of approvals. But anyway, the kind of approval you need to get published is quite strict. And that was the main reason he was getting his papers rejected. One could argue that those papers might have been a net positive in a precautionary way, that to see how things could go wrong. It's not totally clear that ethics of consenting and so forth were worse than papers that are published, and the importance of that kind of information being public. Right now, they're still not published 3 years later, and I think that's a component.
So in simple terms, though, because like a lot of the listeners here, I mean, they probably have heard of DNA, but they don't really understand how all this stuff works.
Yeah.
In simple terms, what is synthetic biology?
So if you want to make a cell or an organism that is different from its ancestors, you can extract DNA or synthesize DNA chemically, build it with the way a computer can help you build a car from first ideas. You can build DNA, and the difference is that DNA will indirectly program the cells to do a variety of chemistries or even develop forms, shapes that are characteristic of what you programmed it to do, which could be quite different from what the ancestral DNA programmed it to do.
So it's sort of a situation where you would like an organism to do something, and you can edit that organism in order to produce the results that you need. So, for example, I mean, you've talked a little bit about how it's possible to edit life forms so that they could capture carbon by making plastics and things like that, or make fuels from eating.
Right. So you can change the metabolism radically. You can get there. I mean, there are some limits to the chemistry that you can do at room temperature, essentially a narrow range of temperatures that life grows in, and a narrow range of pressures and things like that. But within those boundaries, you can make just about any chemical that would be of health consequence, be of agricultural consequence, quite a variety of pigments, flavors, fragrances, and so on.
So fast forward to say 15 years time or 20 years time, what type of applications do you think will be using this technology? Just in terms of someone's daily life, you wake up in the morning, what type of things will people see that's different now to what we're doing now in terms of synthetic biology?
Well, we are seeing the first organs that are transplanted from pigs to humans where maybe a dozen changes have been made to the genome to make them immune compatible. We're going to see, we see that the vaccines that we take are a form of gene therapy where you've got either a viral capsid that's including the DNA from a completely different virus, or you can have something that's not even a virus, it's just a lipid nanoparticle, it's called. It's kind of a membranous coating for a messenger RNA, completely synthetic. So these are things that very much affect our everyday life. Synthetic biology has been used to make a lot of the diagnostic kits that were used during the COVID-19 crisis.
Can I ask? Sorry to interrupt. I was quite intrigued to hear that you described the vaccines as gene therapy, because I feel like there's been a bit of confusion in the public sort of space about that. Because there's been a lot of I guess I've personally seen people who are calling it gene therapy be sort of dismissed as conspiracy theorists. So I was just wondering, like, is it fair to call it gene therapy or not?
The four top vaccines, AstraZeneca, Sputnik, Pfizer, and Moderna, are single genes, typically synthetic, that are encapsulated in the same way you encapsulated gene therapy. All four of those methods are exactly the methods you would use for curing a genetic disease. The subtle difference is that the gene is expressed in say an intramuscular injection. It is expressed into a spike protein, and you have an immune response that amplifies it slightly. Most of your classical gene therapies for, say, curing rare diseases don't get that amplification. But I think there's more similarities than there are differences. It's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, gene therapies are good for you, and vaccines are good for you, and so I don't see how it's a negative either way.
I mean, I don't either. I just found it quite interesting that topic was so inflamed on the internet.
Pig organs. Tell us a little bit about that for like the layperson.
For the first time ever, a man with a life-threatening heart disease successfully received a new heart from a genetically modified pig. Surgeons at the University of Maryland performing this groundbreaking procedure on 57-year-old David Bennett Sr. You see him right there. This is now giving hope to doctors and thousands of patients waiting for organ transplants.
There's been an organ crisis. I've been told that it's gotten a little bit worse when some countries that used to force prisoners to donate organs have responded to international pressure to stop that. Also, there are fewer people on the roads these days with COVID. And so, but there's always a crisis. And furthermore, even under the best circumstances, the organs often arrive in less than ideal circumstances. And so they're rejected, so surgery is canceled. So with pig organs, you can make them in principle as close as necessary to make this so they won't be rejected the way that human to human is. We're not quite at that point yet, but we're at the point where they're not immediately rejected. And furthermore, you can make them resistant to organisms, to infectious diseases. So pigs are naturally resistant to a lot of human-specific diseases like HIV, AIDS, malaria, polio, and so forth. These are human-specific. In fact, a huge fraction of human diseases, even if they were originally acquired by an animal, that was an extremely rare event. And generally speaking, it's just human-to-human transmission.
And how far away do you think that technology is? I mean, when will we be growing organs in other animals and implanting them into people?
So the first pig to human heart transfer was just a few weeks ago. They've been tested pretty extensively in primates, which is a prerequisite for larger human clinical trials. And this will apply to almost all the organs that currently are transplanted from human to human. So it's happening, basically.
So 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when would you predict that this is sort of going to become the mainstream?
Mainstream? I mean, there's not that big, usually not that big a time delay between the beginning of clinical testing and mainstream. I mean, already people get fixed during clinical trials. So clinical trials can take about a decade, but during that decade, many people can get cured. So I would say a decade, roughly. It's already happening.
And so, if it's that easy to get organs, do you think other conditions that we wouldn't normally do an organ transplant for might actually become treated by these animal organs?
It's possible. So, for example, the most common transplant, hematopoietic stem cells, let's say a blood transplant, and there are a lot of diseases where the blood cells are both the first line of defense, but they're also what's being attacked. So, for example, HIV attacks T cells, which are in your blood. So if your T cells were resistant to HIV, that would be a great preventative for HIV. It would have to be extraordinarily safe to be used as a preventative. In general, it's harder to get approval for preventatives, but it could.
What about enhancing humans? I mean, say for example, creating like super soldiers or super intelligent people. I mean, are other countries doing that? Like in terms of like trying to create like a super race of people and things like that?
Well, I think enhancement, we have to be careful with that term because almost all technologies that are adopted are enhancements. If our ancestors wanted to quickly go across the continent, they would just start running. But now we take a jet, and that's an enhancement. Vaccines are an enormous enhancement. They're a couple of dozen killer diseases that would have did terrify our ancestors that we don't even think about. Most of us are not even unaware that smallpox is extinct, and that's something of benefit to the entire planet, and we don't even have to pay for it anymore. So I think we are superhuman compared to our ancestors, and a lot of that is due to physics and chemistry, not fancy genetics. But we're using genetics as well. Vaccines are probably the best example. But enhancement is not something that we're necessarily fearful of. We're addicted to it. Intelligence, I would say that having this little smartphone or other access to information and to schooling, it makes us have a huge advantage over our ancestors, in many ways.
But editing DNA and things like that so that we can actually colonize other planets to be able to do that. Is that possible? Like, will we recognize human beings in 100 years?
It will become normal to change the human genome. Say, getting rid of diseases or propensity to various diseases. Gattaca sort of extreme thing where it's not really edited out, but it's like it's edited in for various enhancements and that kind of thing.
In terms of enhancements, I mean, I used to know Freeman Dyson, and he used to talk about this Russian Polish author from about 200 years ago who wrote about space travel, Konstantin Chislovsky. And he also wrote about editing DNA and things like that so that we can actually colonize other planets to be able to do that. Is that possible? Like, will we recognize human beings in 100 years? Will there be different species of humans on different planets who've sort of edited themselves to be able to live within those environments?
Basically, it transitions from being enhancement to being life and death in certain circumstances. So if we have a pandemic, suddenly we need a new vaccine. If we have unusual pressures from living in a city, then we have to create technologies that deal with those. And certainly in space, the major pressures are low gravity and radiation, maybe neuro and microbial components as well. But almost all of those, we can protect ourselves from radiation by combinations of radiation shielding and magnetic fields, just as on Earth. We can create artificial gravity by centrifugal force. So it will take a very special set of circumstances for us to decide that we can't handle it by advanced medicines on, let's say, after you're born, and advanced physics and chemistry as well. So I think it's unnecessary. It's not so much that we can't do it. It's that we will be very pragmatic about it, and hopefully safety will be a top priority.
So are we in a position to engineer life, sophisticated life, or are we just on the basic sort of very primitive forms of life at the moment?
Well, I would say that engineering a pig heart to go into a human is pretty sophisticated.
Well, I guess I mean conscious. I mean, could we clone people? Could we grow people? Like in the science fiction films, like I'm thinking of Superman, where they kind of have a depository of DNA and then they just grow humans based on that. Is that still fiction? Is there a pathway to that scientific reality?
I think we will probably do things in order of need and urgency, and I don't think there's an urgent need for the sort of things that you're describing. But there's not a fundamental difference between humans and pigs, and we can clone pigs. We do clone pigs in order to make them suitable donors for human parts. So I think that we could do it. I just don't think we will do it in the immediate future because there's not a clearly articulated need for it.
But the reason I was asking about cloning humans is because Elon Musk recently announced his humanoid robot, and it struck me as a strange product to try and sell, this sort of buddy-like, human-like companion that is basically going to be a servant and slave to you, right? It seemed to me from a pure resource perspective that if we're going to go down the road of creating personal helpers, that it's always going to be cheaper to grow them than it is to manufacture them in a manufacturing plant. And I guess I read, I can't remember who wrote this book ages ago, but maybe it's like a famous thought experiment. But the idea was that it's an ethics question about if you can grow a human and sort of have the capacity to put software in their head that makes them sort of love servitude, so they get happiness from it. Is it ethically wrong to do that? And that was the kind of thought dilemma, the kind of quandary that I was thinking about in terms of these personal helpers. So if Elon Musk thinks there's a demand for them, surely it's not going to be, that far away before somebody does think, well, can just grow them. I mean, it could be completely fantastical what I'm saying as well. It's just
it's worth asking fantastical questions. I think one of the advantages of dystopic movies is they help us avoid those dystopias. We may run into other ones, but the more creative we are, the more time we have to prepare to avoid them. I don't think that robotic helpers are necessarily that different from washing machines on the one hand and dogs on the other. I mean, dogs are grown, but they provide a comfort to a lot of people, and as our population shrinks in the cities, we find many countries have an aging population and no one to take care of them, and so it's a humanitarian positive to. It's not necessarily that we can't grow people. It's that they're unevenly distributed in age and geography, and so that having 24/7 monitoring of an aging population could be at least a temporary fix while we're trying to cure diseases of aging and reverse so that they can take care of themselves. So that's one scenario, and there's plenty of other ones. I mean, that there's a whole variety of uses of advanced automation in the house, in the home.
Yeah, I guess in the conventional sense, it's all very specialized, and so a washing machine only does one thing. I guess with what Elon's kind of introduced for the first time is this idea of a generic robot, AI, fueled, whatever, powered helper. Obviously, I mean, his prototype wasn't even there, so it might be ages away, Elon. But I just think it's interesting that he thinks that there's a market for these sorts of entities. And from my dystopic kind of perspective, I just worry that someone will just say, well, we can just engineer biologically clones or humans or some sort of lesser form of intelligence, a la Brave New World, to fulfill that role instead, because it will be cheaper. And there's certainly an argument to be made that, mining the world's raw, very rare metals to create a helper is not as efficient as just growing a human in a lab.
Yeah, I think that's a very important scenario to bring up. It's also possible that rather than decreasing the abilities of a human, we might increase the abilities of an animal, make it so that, say, dogs or chimpanzees could do some of the things that humans currently do. These are important scenarios that they are ethical. These things don't get into our society that easily. There's a general resistance to anything that's this so-called uncanny valley, or where things look kind of human, but they're kind of creepy, and those won't sell to the broad market. Plus, there's a lot of watchdog organizations that will raise the alarm if there's some ethical boundary that's being crossed. So I think, again, it's going to be need-based. And if you have someone that has Alzheimer's and you want to come up with ways to keep them from doing themselves harm by, say, turning on the fire or walking into traffic or something like that, that could be accomplished by something that doesn't even remotely look human. It's something that involves quickly getting a human being into the room, like via video conferencing, something, senses what's going on. Just in general, there aren't really general purpose. Even a humanoid robot would not be completely general purpose, because most humans don't wash their clothes the way they used to. Where they take them and put them in the river and so forth. They go to a machine. So having a humanoid robot that goes from a human to a machine isn't providing that much function. Anyway, I think there will be a niche for robotic dogs and all kinds of robots in the home, and they will be potentially entertaining, but they won't necessarily be that much more entertaining than a flat screen.
I'm not at all as informed about this space as Paul is, but what you're talking about from a lay perspective kind of conjures up these like visions of Dr. Moreau, or the more scary side of things. What do you say to people who are more concerned about the dangers of messing with all these genetic organisms?
Yeah, well, I think that I try not to be arbitrarily reassuring. I think people should be concerned, at least briefly, but it is the job of the Food and Drug Administration and similar agencies around the world that have oversight into safety and efficacy of all drugs. So all drugs have the potential of doing harm until they're proven otherwise, and so you shouldn't be reassured by something that hasn't been through the FDA approval process. But they are certainly, they are like the island Dr. Moreau, except he didn't have an FDA approval for what he did. And we are transplanting organs from pigs to humans. We're transplanting genes from humans to bacteria and then back to humans again. So it is like that. We don't need to sugarcoat that. Well, all you need to do is ask what the outcomes are. I mean, the mechanism shouldn't be quite as important as the outcome. How many people are being cured?
Again, like as a totally naive person, so with the current sort of organ market, I'd heard stories that obviously China was like potentially, I mean, I don't want to say anything too inflammatory, but there are stories that they are sourcing organs from potentially, oppressed populations, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know if like China is also working on that to, in the scientific field because of these pressures for organ? I mean, it sounds like they've got a big demand problem and certainly more room to maneuver and experiment over there. So would we know even if they were ahead of the curve on this stuff? Have you heard anything?
Oh, well, so I think they have responded to international pressure for using organs from prisoners. They're one of many countries that have responded positively and publicly. That did increase the crisis a bit, and they are working on it in parallel and in collaboration with United States companies. So, for example, I co-founded a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts called geneticist, and a sibling company in Hangzhou called called Jihan, and using very similar methods to satisfy different populations. It's not easy to move animals across borders, partly because of foot and mouth disease virus. So it's best to develop to do all the research from scratch in both countries. But it is very active. I would say the leaders in the field.
Well, we interviewed the former head of the Soviet biological weapons program during the Cold War.
Yeah.
What things do you know about sort of biological weapons?
Stepnogorsk in Kazakhstan. This was once the largest biowarfare production facility in the world, and where Dr. Alibek led the team that developed the world's most powerful weapons-grade anthrax. Anthrax and plague were grown here by the ton in gigantic fermenters. On 4 separate occasions, Western spy satellites photographed practice loadings of plague-filled warheads onto intercontinental missiles. This unique plant, devoted to sending the enemy back to the Middle Ages, was geared for war.
We underestimated how big this program was. It was so massive, such capacity that it's unimaginable. They had worked on so many agents. We'd known about plague, anthrax, botulinum toxin, various fevers, different things, but not that many. They had really thought about using these weapons and how to use them and their effects and how to beat defenses, how to beat immunization. I mean, it was a very serious effort here and a part of their planning. That's very scary, it seems to me.
We interviewed the former head of the Soviet biological weapons program during the Cold War.
Yeah.
What things do you know about sort of biological weapons and things that were done, previously, like during the Cold War and things like that? What sort of things have we done, and what concerns you about biological weapons?
Well, so I think a few things. The main thing is weaponizing existing pathogens. Existing pathogens are already quite potent, and you don't need modern synthetic biology to make them more potent. You just need to.
Well, apparently the Soviets had smallpox in intercontinental ballistic missiles ready to launch. So
that they had anthrax, smallpox, not recombined with one another, ready to go. In fact, I know at least one of their factories was shut down.
Because of the anthrax thing.
The anthrax. So it was not a recombinant anthrax. It was just plain old anthrax. So, you can be weaponized by how you make it into a powder, how you deliver it, and so on. But I think with the reduction of the nuclear brinksmanship, I think there's also been a reduction in interest in chemical and biological weapons as well. You could never tell because of secrecy, but it just my instincts are from conversations I've had with the military and with scientists that are one step away. It just doesn't seem as necessary. Again, we're really a fairly practical species. But the thing that worries me is emerging diseases that are not in human control, that were not initiated by humans, and also the possibility of individual humans that had a bad day, or are insane, or highly motivated by some idiosyncratic cultural condition. That worries me more than the governmental does.
So what could these individuals actually do these days with modern technology?
Well, I don't think it requires modern technology, but modern technology, for example, airplanes. You could take someone from, say, an Ebola victim and turn them into aerosols into a bunch of airplanes. We have the main technology that puts us at greater risk is our mobility. That helped the spread of COVID-19, not because anybody had any ill will. It's just that we have trouble controlling our mobility. It's considered some kind of human right almost, at least by some subset of the population, that we can go wherever we want to go, whenever we want to go. We don't have to wear masks. And so that's, to me, more of a threat than any advanced technology. It's just technology we consider ordinary, which is getting access to severely ill patients and then using those as in a highly distributed travel environment.
So does that mean in the future, as these threats grow, and I don't know what the rationale is for why they would be more of a threat than they were, say, 10 years ago, are you sort of suggesting that mobility we might not be entitled to have that as a human right anymore?
As epidemics, as pandemics grow, if a pandemic gets to a significant point of seriousness, then travel is cut off. I mean, we've seen that. And this is not the most serious pandemic that one can imagine that could come out. So yes, we should actually practice it even when we don't need it. That's why you have fire drills and things like that. Is that rare things do happen, and we should be very good at. We shouldn't have to have a supply chain issue with our masks. Every house should be equipped with appropriate levels of masking, and we should be able to switch off our travel wanderlust quite readily. Voluntarily. There were all kinds of voluntary tightening that occurred during the World War II and Great Depression and so forth. And we were, I think, overall, we were either altruistic or we were forced to, or both.
So you mentioned things that could be worse. What sort of things could be worse than COVID? Like what on the horizon in terms of potential risks?
Well, hopefully we're going to get better and better at responding to it. Anything that is spread by contact or respiratory, we know how to. We don't necessarily need a vaccine as our first line of defense. Just social distancing, testing, masks. Protective garments in general. We should be able to snap into that on a moment's notice. There should be no delay. It should be any question. A false alarm should not be our biggest concern. Our concern should be how quickly can we do it. It's like when a fire alarm goes off, for a fire drill, we don't say, "Well, I'm not going to do that." It's not, you can't make me do this fire drill. I suppose some people do, but I think we need to become more altruistic and protective of other people. A lot of people think masks are to protect yourself. They really are intended to protect other people, and that's the way we should think about it. We should be. But in terms of we've seen worse diseases. Most of them don't spread very far. Ebola, SARS, and the first SARS were all worse than current SARS-CoV-2, but they didn't have the dynamics. To some extent, if you kill too quickly or too effectively, then you don't spread.
I've been lobbying within the Australian government. I mean, I do talks in front of ministers and members of the party and things like that. People wouldn't take you seriously, and then suddenly I get this call during COVID saying, "Do you want to work for the government? Can you do stuff?" And one thing that I noticed, the politicians themselves, most of them have no idea what you're talking about, and they're supposed to be the people that are protecting. They don't understand enough, so they can be easily bamboozled by people that are writing grants, that are doing things. But then we need greater knowledge for the politicians in terms of what's going on there, and protections for junior people to be able to speak up if they see that something's happening, and transparency so that junior people can see what's happening and they can contact people in the government, they can contact people in the department and whistleblow. But we don't have that at the moment, because with grants and things like that, you don't want to get fired, you don't want to not be able to get a job, so it's very difficult to whistleblow on things that might actually be very serious.
It would be terrific if every politician were required to know as much science as they know American history. Hopefully they know American history.
Well, it's not hard to do a 6-month course in biology, basic biology.
Right. It would be not. In fact, there are governments where there's considerably higher level of science competence. And for example, in China, a huge fraction of the government has at all levels, from city all the way up, have a bachelor's degree at least in science or engineering, and many of them obtained those degrees after they became politicians. So it wasn't like they failed at science and became a politician. They were very successful politicians. They wanted to be even better at it. So I think it may be on the order of 80% have some kind of a strong science or engineering background, while in the United States it's less than 1%. So I think that's an economic risk as well as then you don't spread.
Obviously, there's a growing recognition that COVID itself might have been engineered in the lab and leaked. And I think there is a wider perception, especially if that story is verified properly, that maybe a lot of these pandemics are being sort of catalyzed by our own sort of overly, unconstrained curiosity, Pandora's box style. There is a lot of, I guess, contempt for scientists who are tinkering away, ignoring moratoriums on gain of function or whatever. Do you think that is a fair, perspective from a lot of people? I mean, because the alternative is obviously the, what you hear in response is that, well, there's also any moment a natural origin pandemic could be sparked by all sorts of, factors. But I think as far as the population is concerned, if COVID is proven to be man-made, then they look at the long sort of historical record and they think, well, we haven't had to live through something like COVID in the last 80 years or whatever, not since the Spanish flu. I think it's a hard sell sometimes, this idea that there is a greater risk than there was, say, 10 years ago of a very critical pandemic coming, and being justifying all these terribly repressive countermeasures. I guess what I'm trying to say is that people, I think, are quite suspicious of the scientists and that they might have more of a triggering role in these pandemics than nature.
I think it's extremely unlikely that scientists were anything but positive for smallpox, polio, 1918 flu, Ebola, HIV, malaria, just every one of them. In every case, we've developed vaccines when we could. For HIV, we haven't been able to develop a vaccine, but we've developed drugs. Many of those have had a larger death toll than COVID-19. We just have been, it's the new kid on the block, and so we've paid it more attention. But HIV and malaria have killed more people than COVID-19. It's extremely unlikely that anything intentional was done. I think it's fairly unlikely anything accidental was done to COVID-19. There's sufficient risk of naturally occurring. And really, we should take some of the lessons that we've learned from responding to the natural part of COVID-19 and apply it to other diseases that are threatening mankind, like malaria and HIV. I just don't think there's a high level of motivation for scientists to be. Now, it is true that scientists have done gain of function research, but that was aimed at preparing ourselves for what they considered and justifiably is an inevitability, that those diseases that they were exploring could, if they happen naturally and we were unprepared for them, it could be worse than any previous disease. And so, since we do have good containment facilities, with a lot of surveillance, they could be used. I don't personally do that kind of research, but I think it's not a simple decision as to whether we put ourselves at greater risk or less risk by not doing those experiments. I think it's something that requires a lot of oversight. And I think we need to develop a better culture of whistleblowing. That is to say, when one scientist thinks, or one person thinks another person is doing something risky, they should, if you see something, say something. And there should be rewards for people that notice something that's harmful, whether it's intentional or not. And there should be punishment for people who report things that seem contrary to modern medicine.
I mean, the whistleblowing is interesting because, I was investigating the lab leak, and I did speak to a number of virologists, and some of them felt very scared to talk because at the time, it was considered taboo, and they were fearful of their careers being sort of put on the line. And I had not appreciated that there was that sort of I guess, mood going on in the scientific community. It didn't strike me as very healthy for science, where I think speaking out and being transparent is incredibly important. So that implies to me like that the idea that the scientists are always doing, they might not be wittingly being, wittingly taking risks, but there's certainly some of these characters involved in the story of gain of function and eco health and all that. Not to get too embroiled, there were some very big egos and a lot of big characters who did want to, I think from a public perspective, there is a fear that the egos and the desire to make a discovery outweighs the mitigation efforts that you against the risks that you're taking. But
well, once again, I don't want to reassure. I want the public to be concerned about these sorts of things. And I think that just like I've advocated the equivalent of fire drills, where we test our ability to respond to sudden threats like pandemics, I think we should also have fire drills where we see if we're good at whistleblowing. So in other words, rather than creating a culture where people are afraid to blow a whistle, we should create a culture where we're going to simulate an event where someone's doing something they shouldn't be doing, and seeing how many people around them report it. Not with actual pathogen or anything, just notebooks that say, oh, I'm doing, I'm making designer babies. I'm making, I'm bringing smallpox back. And then if their colleagues don't report them, then their colleagues get fines or imprisonment or whatever. Something that creates a strong reporting culture rather than a fearful one. I think that would be a net positive. We'd have to also manage there could be negative. You don't want the medicine to be worse than the disease, and so you don't want to create something where there's a lot of false alarms where people report people that aren't doing anything wrong. But you got to have a system where the false alarms are quickly dissipated and it can be done in such a way that reputations are not tarnished incorrectly. So I really think that's important. I mean, there were lots of people that knew about the babies that were born, the CRISPR babies, both in China and the United States, and none of them reported it.
And so my final question, just a bit off topic, is how can DNA be used to store data and in computers? Will we have biological computers?
So this was something that got a big boost. It goes way back. The idea goes way back, but it got a big boost when I published my book, which was encoded. Even the photographs were encoded with DNA. We made 70 billion copies of them, and I published a peer-reviewed paper on this. Since then, it gained momentum with pretty well-known international companies like Technicolor and Microsoft encoding larger and larger data sets, including movies. And now there's a international consortium to advance this technology. But I think an even better, more natural application than trying to, I mean, it has advantages over conventional storage and disadvantages. The advantages are that it has a better track record for longevity. So the oldest DNA that we've been able to read is over 1 million years old, while the oldest disk drive that we can still read, there's a lot of digital information that's been lost. And it's nowhere near 1 million years old, more like decades. So it's also, it can be stored without energy consumption. It can be made copies, like I said, we made 70 billion copies of my book for a few pennies. But its disadvantage is it's not as fast yet. You can't use it the way you would use a thumb drive. But I think a more interesting application is one where we can now store data in every cell of a body. We've done it in mice, and we can store a terabyte of information in just a billionth of the mass of the animal. So it's not like it's perturbing not like it's a giant disk drive around your neck. It's just this tiny distributed throughout the body, and it could record physiological data, historic data about how your cells grew and developed. And that could be like a flight recorder on a airplane, where you don't routinely read flight recorders after every flight. You read them, the part of the flight recorder that tells you what you want to know. Like whether which wing went, which communication system went out, and so forth. And the same thing could be done in a medical situation. If something weird happens, you want to be able to take those cells.
So, final question: what is something in the world that we don't know about that we should know about?
That is underreported.
You mean all of us?
Underreported. Something that's underreported.
Well, I don't think this is a complete blind spot, but essentially floating around us are microorganisms, and we're blind to them. And I've been advocating that we should have a culture of bioweather maps. There's this sort of like how our affection for weather maps. It's one of the few citizen science things that citizens actually understand that affects their lives, their health, which is weather. And we should have a similar relationship with bioweather. We shouldn't wait until we have a pandemic level. We should have interest in things that could be patient zero, but we don't know yet. We should talk about those. We should talk about, whether a particular daycare or room or airline is got diseases in it that you're at risk for. So I think we have the technology to do both local and global monitoring. We just need to have the cultural interest in it.
Say an organization was formed to do that. How would it work? So you just tests, or what needs to be done?
Some organizations to do that. We have industries that produce testing devices. We have the CDC. We have the news organizations that do weather maps. They could just do another segment on the bioweather map. It's partly is to make it entertaining enough that you pay attention to it.
So it's sort of like
stuff is in place. It's just a matter of marketing and figuring out how to scaling it up in response to demand.
And so what would be a bioweather report?
Yeah, someone's sort of saying, oh, there's a COVID storm brewing over here, and a tornado of Ebola, and you're kind of giving a picture of best to stay in today because there's a bit
there's a lot of flu going around in this area here. There's colds going around here.
Yeah. So we're moving in that direction. I mean, it's not. When I suggested this back in 2002, this was alien, but now we do. People pay attention. They know the difference between Omicron and Delta. That's part of the news. It's just as likely to impact our life as the weather is. Slipping and falling, or putting on proper tires, or you name it. They're both risk. They're risks that in one case we pay attention to, in the other case we're just starting to develop a culture where we're paying attention.
So it's sort of like the Boston Green Line has a significant amount of cold virus, especially around Brookline. Just letting everybody know.
Right. It could even be personalized. You could have something where your risk factors, and it could be that you've already been vaccinated against that strain, or it could be that you have a genetic predisposition, like I have risk factors for respiratory problems. And so, and it could be generalized to include allergies and pollutants and all these things. It could be all part of the kind of chemical and bioweather map. It could even be easier than watching. You don't necessarily have to watch the Weather Channel to get the weather. I mean, it could go straight into your cell phone, and your cell phone could decide what's actionable for you specifically and filter out all the stuff that you don't need to know. There's a variety of ways you can do this, but the point is we need a culture of bioweather map attention that we currently have in pretty good shape for conventional weather.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, George. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have you in at some stage in the future.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you did a great job at it.